I am informed of the migrants who left Europe to find a new home on our native land. Whatever their own actions, they remain still part of me.
And I think this is the most problematic intervention for me. So the settlers, the land thieves who left Europe and came here, pillaged, stole our land, oppressed us, he identifies with them and basically says whatever their actions. Welcome to another episode of Andile Mngxitama podcast. Please do not forget to subscribe. Click on the button below, subscribe, so that you are able to follow the new episodes which are coming. We always try to provide an analysis of our situation so that we develop critical black perspectives. Today, we're going to discuss the philosopher king, the pipe-smoking, Irish poetry-loving former President Thabo Mbeki. This man, in the minds of many, he is a shining hope and a radical who want change for our people. In fact, many shall never forgive President Zuma, a mere peasant from Gandla, to defeat him at that Polokwane conference to become president of the country. You know, the contrast between Zuma and Mbeki is just too huge. Mbeki is properly trained in the white idiom. But what I want us to focus on today is how Thabo Mbeki is projected as one thing, but doing the other. Professor Patrick Bond wrote the book, Thabo Mbeki, Talking Left, Walking Right. He talks left, he walks right. And he went on to explain the projects of Thabo Mbeki, which are left in rhetoric, but right-wing in actual application. So I want us to just go back to one of his biggest contributions in the popular imagination, the speech he gives at the adoption of the South African Constitution, a constitution which we know is anti-black, a constitution which we know locks into white hands the stolen land in that section 25, which is called the property clause, which basically says, if we want to get our land back, we must buy it from white people. But Thabo Mbeki gave that speech, I'm an African. Everybody remembers that speech. In fact, it was even parts of it chopped into popular songs. Everybody talks about how erudite, how stylistically competent, how talented that oratory was of Thabo Mbeki, I'm an African speech. Just after he gave that speech, I overheard a very interesting conversation between Professor Ashwin Desai and some of his friends. And Ashwin Desai simply said, imagine if a frog was to stand up amongst other frogs and said, I am a frog. He thought that would be seen as a hilarious moment, and all these other frogs will laugh and say, sit down. But in this situation, I'm an African, which is supposed to be a given, was seen as a path-breaking contribution. But I think that if we look carefully and we analyze critically that speech, poem-like, you get to understand Thabo Mbeki's politics. You get to understand where he comes from, and later on I'll talk about some of the moves that he makes. But for instance, he says things like, at times, and I fear, I've wondered whether I should concede equal citizenship of our country to the leopards and the lion and the elephant and the springbok, the hyenas, the black mambas, and the pestilential mosquito. And then, of course, he has already spoken about the fauna and the flora. So basically, he talks about the mountains and the hills. And now he comes to a very problematic, I think, intervention when he says, I owe my being to the koi and the sun, whose desolate souls haunt the great expanse of the beautiful Cape. They who fell victim to the most merciless genocide our native land has ever seen. They who were first to lose their lives in the struggle to defend our freedom and the dependence, and they who, as a people, perished in the result. Now, the interesting thing is, he gives props to the koi and the sun for standing up against land thieves. But you see, he does not call for the land of the koi and the sun to be returned. He does not even call for reparations for this genocidal project which has gone on. Then he said, and I think this is the most problematic intervention for me, I am informed of the migrants who left Europe to find a new home on our native land. Whatever their own actions, they remain still part of me. I mean, so the settlers, the land thieves who left Europe and came here, pillaged, stole our land, oppressed us, he identifies with them and basically says, whatever their actions, they form part and still remain part of me. You see, this is a deeply congressman, the kind of ANC man that adopts the Freedom Charter and starts off the Freedom Charter by giving the land rights of Africans away by saying South Africa belongs to all who live in it, both black and white. Thabo Mbeki is a proper congressman in this way. The Congress that Sobukwe left when it became a white project. Despite his beautiful, eloquent rendition of this kind of imagery, he still finds a way in which he provides cover for white capital and settler colonialists. And so this speech goes on and on like this, where basically Mbeki's political, if you like, motif and practice is cemented. If you want to understand Thabo Mbeki, you have to go to this, African speech and carefully, critically evaluate how it erases, whilst rhetorically raising suffering, it erases all the time reparations. It never calls out the oppressor to do good the acts of oppression. Now, this talking left, doing or working right, we saw it also when Thabo Mbeki introduced the GEAR project. Now, GEAR is replaced the RDP, Reconstruction and Development Program, which was the ANC program of 1994, which is where basically the ANC articulated vision for South Africa, including the fact that 30% of the land must be returned in the first 5 years. It is there. Go look at it at the RDP. So the RDP was a redistributive policy which attempted to address the colonial legacy and apartheid plunder. Thabo Mbeki rejects RDP. He brings in the new liberal gear policy. At a time, in 1996, when he brought a gear, rejected RDP, he says, call me a Thatcherite, if you like, responding to Paulo Jordan, who had called the gear policy a Thatcherite policy proposal. Now, Margaret Thatcher, we must remember, she was seen as the political figure that represented neoliberalism. And so when Paulo Jordan says this is a Thatcherite program, he was basically saying it's a neoliberal project, it's going to undermine the interests of our people, it's going to bring stumbling blocks to transformation. And Thabo Mbeki responded by saying, if you like, call me a Thatcherite. And then we know that he removed Paulo Jordan in his cabinet as part of punishing him for raising a critical voice against this left talk, right move. Then we know that at the same time, massive amounts of wealth were removed from South Africa when the big 5 companies of South Africa delisted from the stock exchange, Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and listed in the London Stock Exchange. That was one of the biggest reparations of capital outside of South Africa. And we're not talking about the illicit outflows of capital, which was also happening at the same time. So Thabo Mbeki gifted white capital with massive amounts of wealth, which are now locked in the London Stock Exchange. But again, this talk left, work right, is seen in Thabo Mbeki's African Renaissance project. The African Renaissance project itself is the reclamation of Africa, the revival of Africa, the standing up against all which has gone on against the African. A great project. But look at what its economic legs, if you like. NEPAD. Now, NEPAD is this program which Mbeki articulated, which basically is a neoliberal, neo-colonial, pro-Western project of the IMF and the World Bank. He says African Renaissance. That talk is affirming, is even left, if you like. But what economic model, what implementation instrument he brings in is a neo-colonial, neoliberal project which entrenches our insertion into global economy as the exploited. But his speech, his talk, is one of empowerment. His actions are the ones of this empowerment. We can go back and also see during the negotiations, Thabo Mbeki is the one who negotiated with the right-wingers in South Africa to insert in our constitution section 235, which is basically a section that says white racists can, if they want, in South Africa, have independent states. The Orania is one of the result of this section. It is in the constitution of this country. It was negotiated by Thabo Mbeki with the right-wingers the last moment. Now, we don't know who gave him the mandate to do so, but he found this clause into the constitution, which basically gives white people the right to recreate apartheid, to create white enclaves. And that is why Cape Town, as you know, the white racists there want to cut Cape Town out of South Africa. And they're talking about a Cape state, independent state of the Western Cape. And they're going to rely on this clause in the Constitution, which gives self-determination, a constitutional protection, and a possibility. Now, an agreement is signed, it is there, where Thabo Mbekis signed with the Afrikaner right-wingers that they must not worry. The Constitution will protect their rights to self-determination. In other words, goodbye apartheid, but welcome back apartheid in the constitution of the country. A matter which was negotiated, signed off by Thabo Mbeki. And then we see that Thabo Mbeki coming to power after the end of the sunset clauses, which forced the ANC to co-rule with the apartheid National Party. We saw that when Thabo Mbeki takes over, the ANC gets 2/3 majority. The ANC did not need any political party to come and assist it to change the constitution in order to make it serve the interests of black people. You know, sometimes I argue that we can actually forgive Nelson Mandela and say that Nelson Mandela was focused on giving political power to black people. Now, there are two ways to get to political power: is to shoot our way to Pretoria, which was an impossibility, or to negotiate power incrementally, arrive at the same position where we take over political power because of our numerical strength. So Mandela cut a deal with white people. He accepted a weak constitution. He was in a co-governance with them for 5 years. It was a limited period of time. Then thereafter, the army was already transformed in the sense that it was in our hands. The secret police, which was murdering us, was also completely out of the picture. We controlled the state in the sense that the police was also highly transformed and controlled by and large by us. So after the first 5 years, the apartheid machinery for violence was by and large undermined, and the majority democratic process makes the possibility for radical transformation to happen. We have now in our hands political power, 2/3 majority, negotiated by the compromises that Tatu Mandela had entered into, allowing us this possibility for total transformation because we have the 2/3 majority. And this is the 2/3 majority Thabo Mbeki had. Thabo Mbeki refused to use the 2/3 majority to transform the South African society. In fact, he entered into quarrels with white people because white people, of course, they did not, as we know, take him seriously. They projected their racism, and he responded to that racism through outbursts, such as on the HIV AIDS thing. He took the wrong policy direction because white people, of course, were saying all those negative things about us. We even think that bringing the World Cup to South Africa was part of his attempt to say we as Africans can be as great, as efficient as the West. His over determination to prove to whites that we as black people are somehow as good as white people, put him in this position where he was unable to move to transform South Africa. Somebody once said that Thabo Mbeki shall never forgive his parents for making him black. His whole imagination is a coconut imagination. His whole mannerism, as we know, is highly polished English mannerism, of course, more Irish, in fact. Now, as we say that he has this 2/3 majority. Mandela had negotiated it. Mandela gives him political power. Mbeki can do as he wishes with the state. And in fact, he did do as he wished with the state. But he didn't do that to transform the state and the polity so that it can serve the interests of black people. Now, part of this talking left, walking right, was so clearly manifest in the fight between Mbeki and Zuma. Now, Mbeki was kicked out, Zuma was in power, and Zuma said, I think it's 2017, where Zuma spoke about, he was in parliament, and he said, black people must unite to realize land expropriation without compensation. And Thabo Mbeki wrote a 30-page document, Google it, where he responded to this call by Zuma to unite, for black political parties to unite. Zuma was very clear in his articulation that black political parties must unite to realize land expropriation without compensation, to address the legacy of apartheid and colonialism in terms of land theft. This offended Mbeki so much that he wrote a 30-page document responding to this. And Mbeki there is very clear that Zuma is anti-ANC by calling for black unity. Firstly, when I read that, I said, Mbeki is crazy. Mbeki has lost his mind. But then I read the document again, and I realized that, in fact, Thabo Mbeki is consistent. He has internalized the idea that South Africa belonged to both black and white. And therefore, that gives away the claims for land of black people. Because if the land equally belongs to black and white, what is the basis for black people to claim land from white people? And that is why Mbeki writes this document, he says, Zuma is anti-ANC. Because in the ANC lexicon, in the ANC imagination, in the ANC perspective, there is no black and white. It is only South African citizens who have equal claim to land. And in this way, of course, erasing the historical grievance of black people and the fact that we remain excluded as a consequence of land theft by white people. But yes, that is Thabo Mbeki. He writes this document and he reminds his readers that there were others in the past who came with this idea of South Africa belonging to black people who were rejected, such as the PAC. In fact, in that document, basically claims that Zuma is bringing back to the ANC notions which were rejected and defeated of blackness. Can you believe it? That blackness is not accepted in the ANC. Now, this is a man who talks about African Renaissance. This is the man who supported the Native Club. This is the man who talks about the renewal of Africa, but in his whole makeup, his ideological makeup, you cannot elevate blackness. You have to remain neutral, colorblind, always deferring to whiteness by not calling it out and by not presenting history as a one-sided affair where black people were defeated, where black people were robbed and black people oppressed by white people. This is Thabo Mbeki's project. I mean, you know, it is unbelievable that he would even write a document to refute the notion of black unity as central to creating a black majority, a political black majority, to address the legacies of colonialism and apartheid. But yeah, that you are. That's Thabo Mbeki, the man who speaks black but acts white. The man who works, who speaks, who talks left but works right. And you can see from going back to his African speech, look beyond the inviting, captivating rhetorics. Look at the meaning behind the rhetorical device that he uses. You will find a right-wing project. You will find an anti-black project. So Thabo Mbeki is indeed the intellectual of reaction. He is our pipe-smoking coconut. He is the philosopher of whiteness. But as we know, he speaks eloquently black, but acts effectively white. And part of his legacy, I would argue, is what we see today in South African politics, where political leaders speak so eloquently about the black problematic, but when you look in their action, it's always affirming whiteness. Take our brother, Julius Malema, for instance. He speaks very eloquently about blackness, the black child, the black pain and suffering. But look at his actions. He's been able to strengthen the hand of white capital and white power to give him political power to white anti-black political forces. So, Thabo Mbeki has, in a sense, provided this practice of speaking black but acting white, of talking left, of walking right. That is Thabo Mbeki, the philosopher king of our nation. Thank you.